The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Rancher training. My name is Shannon Williams, and I'm here with Denise Shannon, our quality assurance lead here at Rancher, and we are going to be your hosts today for this introduction to Rancher meetup and training session. I think we're going to have a relatively large group for this type of a training. Typically, we expect to have 5 or 10 people and have it as a very big open discussion. But since this is the first one we're running, we've got quite a large group of people attending. So we'll be running today's session a little bit more like a normal meetup, where we do most of the talking and take your questions as they come in over the GoToWebinar screen. Just for anyone who doesn't know me, I'm one of the co-founders here at Rancher and run all of our marketing and customer engagement work. My name's Shannon, and I'm with Denise Shannon, who runs our quality assurance program and works with a lot of our customers in our forums. Denise, are you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Awesome. All right. So we should be able to answer a lot of your questions and give you a good overview of Rancher over the course of the next hour or so. Really, in terms of what we're hoping to accomplish today, there's really a key couple of things we want to see happen. The first is we're really trying to give a good technical introduction to Rancher. So today's focus is going to be on how to use the platform, how to set it up if you haven't already, how to deploy an application, how to deploy hosts, and through all that, we are going to be, answering as many questions as you have. So if you have questions, fire away. Let us know what you'd like to see answered. We're going to try and keep the slides to a minimum. So instead of, going through lots of slides and, theoretical stuff, we'll really be working mostly off of the documentation for the product and actually diving into some demo environments. And it's really that bit, demoing and showing things that we always find to be the most helpful for us when we're trying to get our hands around a new piece of technology. So I would highly, recommend that everyone, follow along at home and, try to, kind of follow, do some of the things we're doing in our demo environment on your own system. So take a look at what we're doing, and as always, we won't leave until all your questions are answered. So don't worry if you've asked a question or it hasn't been answered. We'll be getting to it before we go away. So we're going to stay here as long as that takes. Another thing to just sort of consider as we get going is that if you haven't used GoToWebinar before, you'll notice on the little side pullout that there's a questions tab, and that allows you to just sort of type in questions that you'll have for Denise or I. Please use that. We'll be monitoring that. If I'm talking, Denise will be keeping an eye on it. If she's talking, I'll be keeping an eye on it. We'll try to read out your questions as they come in. If you're asking something that we're about to show, we may kind of hold off for a minute on it, so don't be discouraged if we don't respond to it right away. But just fire off your questions as you're going, and we'll try to get to all of them as quickly as we can. One of the things that I wanted to do to start today's session was to just kind of gather up a little bit of information about your familiarity with Rancher. I imagine some of you will be coming to it brand new, and that's fine. So if you're just getting started, no worries. Let us know. If you've kind of been working on it for a few weeks and you're basically getting used to being a cowboy, that's fine too. And certainly for those grizzled veterans out there, just sort of let us know, and we'll try to address that as well. So we just sent out the poll. You'll see sort of some options for how to sort of rank yourself in terms of what your current level of experience with Rancher is, and feel free to kind of include if you think you've got some more ideas, or if there's again, for those of you out there who are sort of experienced with this and feel really comfortable with Rancher, let us know if there's some more advanced topics you want us to cover during their training session today. All right, looks like about half of everybody has voted, so we'll probably give it another. There we go. Last few people are straggling in, and we're going to close the poll and share it out, so hopefully everyone can see the results. So it looks like, Denise, about 53% said they're city slickers, just getting ready to get started with Rancher. About 40% have got have been going for a little while now and have a reasonable understanding of it. And it looks like we have one or two people who are as grizzled as John Wayne. So that feel free to fire in questions of all levels. Also, if obviously between Denise and I, hopefully we can answer most of your questions. But if there are any questions that go beyond our ability to answer, maybe something really technical about how we do networking or load balancing or something on the storage side, we can always pull in someone else from the team or try and get back to you with an answer. So don't worry too much if you've got really challenging questions. We'll do our best to get the answers sorted. Okay, a couple things I wanted to kind of focus on before we jumped into the demos. One was really just the primary resources that we feel like everyone should know about in case you don't already. First is docs, and like any beta level project, our docs are kind of a continuously evolving set of information. They're all hosted in GitHub, so they're out there for for us to edit, and also for as this is an open source project, for anyone else to contribute edits to as well. So you should be able to get a lot of information from the docs. But if you ever see anything that you feel like it's not accomplishing or could be better, we love people to to put in examples or to submit PRs to the docs with changes. But by and large, the docs should give you a really good place to get started, to understand the different concepts, to learn about how to configure and set up Rancher, to get into some of the more complex setups of doing things like upgrading or if you want to contribute at some point. So docs are a great place to start, but obviously they're only part of the answer. The other really useful resources for for people that are part of the beta has been our forums. So if you go to forums.rancher.com and you can find links to both the forums and the docs on our website, very prominently, you'll be able to get in touch with our team. You'll be able to ask questions and get answers from the community as well as from us. And these tend to be one of the best places to to get help. The other place that you can get help is within GitHub. I don't know if I have a slide on GitHub, but if you just go to github.rancher.com, github.com/rancher/rancher, you'll find the Rancher environment where you can see all of the open issues. You can look at some of the changes that are being made to the code. You can actually submit pull requests if you see something that needs to be fixed or anything. And the issues section is really useful if you haven't seen it before. This is really where we track all of the bugs. We track some requests for enhancements. We see what people are asking questions about. And if you're running into an issue that's a little more challenging, you may have hit a bug, or you may have found something that's not working appropriately in the product, given that it is beta, please come on in, file an issue. Even if it's a replica issue, we'll help you figure out if it's already sort of something that we're tracking, and then you can track that issue until it's resolved. So issues are a great tool that you can use as well as you're sort of working through Rancher and learning how to get started with it. Okay, so the key things that we're going to cover in today's training are really the following few things. The first is how to set up Rancher, how to actually install it. We'll talk a little bit about the two approaches where you can set up Rancher either as just a single container from a management server perspective, or you can actually build it out as a clustered service that's a little more resilient. We'll then talk about access control and how you start to share this with people in your organization. And those are kind of administrative tasks. So if you're just a user of Rancher and you don't actually have to set it up and someone else has built it in your organization, you can sort of ignore those first few pieces. Though we will talk a little bit about inviting people to participate in things and how you manage your participation in groups. Then we'll jump into sort of more the individual actions that you'll take as a user, creating environments, setting up and connecting to registries like Docker Hub, you know, adding hosts and resources, different approaches for talking to the Rancher server, the UI, the API, the CLI. We'll kind of explain what those are. We'll then jump into just creating containers and how to basically do a Docker run within Rancher. We'll then talk about creating stacks and services, which is a pretty involved process. We'll talk about Docker Compose and Rancher Compose and how to spin up entire applications from a template. Then we'll talk a little bit, if we haven't already covered it, we'll kind of hit on load balancing and service discovery and sort of how you start to take these applications and expose them out to either other internal services or out to the internet. If we haven't covered it all already, I want to make sure we answer any questions that are about networking. And we'll dive into networking in a little bit more depth because it does tend to be sort of a highly important topic for people to address. So that's sort of what we wanted to talk about. There's a few questions that came in already that I wanted to sort of maybe try and address to begin with. I mean, one of the first question was, is Rancher already mature for a production environment? And this was asked by Shakisha. I hope I'm saying that right. And it's a great question. I mean, Rancher is a beta product, which means that we haven't officially certified it as GA yet. It had only started beta about 10 weeks ago, 10, 11 weeks ago, so it's pretty relatively new to beta. We've been working on Rancher for more than a year as a team. And in terms of its maturity for production, there are lots of people who use Rancher in production. We hear about them from people all the time. You certainly can do that. As we release things, we test them for upgrades. But from our perspective, it's still a beta product, which means that we haven't reached the level of maturity that we feel we can say this is GA and provide real support services around the product yet. So hopefully that answers your question, Shakisha. Certainly a lot of people use Rancher in production already, and we hear about it every day from lots and lots of organizations. But it's not something that we've yet called Rancher a GA level product. It looks like there are a couple technical questions that have rolled in that are about things like drivers and stuff. So I'll try to answer these as we go through the session. Kirti Raja, hopefully I'm saying that right. And then Simone, you had asked a question about will we talk about volumes. We definitely can talk about volumes. So we'll hit and talk about volumes a little bit as we're going as well. And if we don't get enough into that, Simone, let me know. Shoot off specific questions, and we'll try to show you that. Volumes is an area that's changing a lot in Rancher. If you guys haven't seen, we just made an announcement last week about Rancher Convoy, which is a new project we're starting where we're going to be supporting persistent storage. It's not yet available in Rancher, so there's nothing to show and demo within the product, but in the next month or so, you'll start to see a lot of capabilities like that finding their way into Rancher. And it kind of goes back to Shakisha's question about production ready. A lot of the work that's going into Rancher still during the beta is actually adding new capabilities and features that we feel are important for users. Capabilities like support for LDAPs and different types of directories, which we're just added. So and that also goes to storage. There's a lot of work where we're doing on storage that extend Rancher and add value to it. That doesn't mean that the current functions aren't stable. A lot of them are very stable, been around for 6 to 8 months. But the product's still changing at a relatively fast rate. So hopefully that gives you an idea about where what the level of maturity is in the project. The other thing is because this is an online session, obviously Denise and I are going to be doing most of the talking. But if you have a question and it's it's a little bit more of a complex question, I may ask you to ask it out loud. So I won't open up anyone's mic without getting their sort of sign off before, but you may see if you ask a question, I may say, would you mind asking this question? And if you're okay with that, I'll open up your mic and you can maybe ask the question so everyone else can hear it and we can have a little bit more of a discussion on a topic as well. So feel free also to mention that in your question that if you'd like to just ask one verbally, I'm happy to open you up and you can talk about that as well. Okay, so now time to get started. Denise, if you're ready, I'm going to transfer over the mic to you. Give me 1 second.
I can take it.
Great. Well, I'm going to turn over the. Oh, can you make yourself a presenter? Oh, you can. Great. There you go. All right.
Okay.
Why don't you take it away?
Yep. So I'm gonna, since it sounds like like at least half of you are, just getting started, I'm gonna go through the training a little bit, as I'm gonna show you where you can find the stuff in the docs. I'm gonna launch Rancher and kind of come back and forth between the docs and the product, so that as we go through it, you can kind of see where in the documentation you can read more in depth about what we're doing. But when you first come to here, I mean, the main thing that everyone should probably read about is how to installing Rancher Server. And so there are a series of ways you can install Rancher Server with SSL, with a single node, with an HA setup. And so in our example today, we're just going to do what the basic running of Rancher Server and get it up. So I've already kind of downloaded, I ran the command, and then usually what happens is when you first run it, if you immediately go to the UI, which will be like your IP address and followed by :8080, at first it'll say it's not available, but then as soon as the logs have shown that it'll take like a minute or two, and the logs will end up printing out basically saying that startup has succeeded and we're now listening and ready to, and Rancher Server is up and running. And so when you first enter this page, you will see, before you get started, you need to add your first host, and then after that is adding your first server. So if you go to the add host page, and this is probably one of the things that, we get a lot of questions, or where people start to play around with it. What host registration does is, it needs to know this is what the Rancher agent will then communicate back to Rancher Server. And so in my case, I keep it really simple because I have this public IP. I'll just save it as what the IP, the address of what Rancher Server is right now, because it's all open. And then immediately following from that, you can begin to add hosts. Now I'm going to just jump back to the Rancher documentation, because adding hosts kind of brings in a whole set of sections of, how to get started with hosts. There's all kinds of hosts that you can add, and it goes through in details if you wanted to do these different cloud providers, what you need to provide. And I'll go into a little more depth of, what are the options that you can do with hosts after it's added. But in my case, we're going to do a fairly simple one because I've already launched some hosts in GCE. I'm just going to go to the custom page. You get a command as a custom command for your specific environment, and I'm going to switch to my terminal and go to my agents to add them. And while those get up, I'm going to go back a little bit to, I think, what access control is, just so that we can get our setup going. So you'll see them pop up as we talk. So when you first arrive, you're going to notice that as
Hey Denise, before you jump into that, there was a question came in that I think is kind of an interesting one. Ken Luberts asked if there was any way of changing the base URL after an installation. Like if you've set this up and you want to change the actual URL of the service, can you do that?
That's a great question. I actually don't know.
I know that people often will use some kind of, they obviously use an actual DNS entry and some type of a name for deploying Rancher, and then point that to the IP address, obviously, where they're hosting it. So you should be able to use any URL that you have an A record for and can change the, the direct, point to the IP address. But obviously, the IP address for the host is what you're really calling from whatever URL you set up. So I think you just set up set up any URL and point it to the IP address of the server and the port that Rancher is hosted on, and you should be able to do that. Hopefully that answers your question, Ken.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was just reading the question. So there is, okay, I guess the question is, I could go, so I focus on the, I have another question about, so I know a lot of people, I'm going to go back one step because I didn't do this in my demo, where if you wanted to set up a host that is, typically we don't recommend running Rancher server and Rancher agent. That's what adding a host is essentially running as a Rancher agent image on the same machine. But, when people are trying it out and for development purposes, we completely understand that, people are going to set it up. And what we have in the documentation is to talk about when you want to add your host onto the same machine as Rancher server. We recommend that you edit the custom command and add in this environment variable of cattle agent IP equals IP of Rancher server, or if you redirected it to somewhere, then you would add in, that URL. But basically, you would do that so that when Rancher agent sets up, it will pick the correct IP so that of the machine, so that Rancher server and Rancher agent will be able to communicate with each other. So that kind of, I think, answers Israel's question that he just asked about whether or not you need to add it. You only really need to add it for edit the environment variable for when you add in Rancher agent to the same host as Rancher server.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to close the questions and focus kind of on what's going on.
I'll keep an eye on the questions.
Okay, that's fine. So when you first log in, you'll notice that there's this big red bar that says access control is not configured, and you can go to the settings. So what that means is, right now, any of you who wanted to could take this URL that I have here and could open it up yourself and see it. And so, obviously we don't want anyone from the outside public just being able to use your API or use your UI. And so the first thing we usually recommend is, you should set up your access control. So access control is basically limiting who can communicate to your Rancher server. With our most recent release, we added the support for LDAP, but for this training purposes, we're just going to go through the GitHub steps of access control of turning it on. So follow the instructions, which are fairly simple, of just going to GitHub, basically authorizing it, and getting back client ID and client secret. And you can authenticate with GitHub. And then I say, it's good. So now at this point, my Rancher server setup, if you had copied my IP and had decided to go check it out, is now no longer available for you to go look at. And so to be able, you'll notice that the red bar is gone. And so that means, the easy handy settings bar has disappeared. If you go into this upper right-hand corner icon of my avatar, you'll see that under here, under administration, there's access control. So now whoever is the first person to turn on access control of Rancher server is now considered the admin of Rancher server, and they will be the only ones who can update access control and the host registration for Rancher server. And so in the documentation, all these settings that are in this upper right-hand corner, this drop-down, is under the configuration section of our docs, because it's really talking about how do you configure your Rancher server for whatever your own purposes are. So now that access control is up, what you might want to do is say, because right now it's only me who can access it, I might want to say, oh, I want to share this with Shannon. And so the next thing, so access control if you imagine it, puts a wide net around your Rancher server so no one else can do it. But then you might, if you're the admin, you might actually have two separate teams that you want to access Rancher server, but you don't want them to share resources. And so right now, maybe I'll create another, what we call environment, to my Rancher server setup. So maybe I'll call this Shannon, so that I could share with Shannon, and then I can, I forget what his.
355.
Oh.
You had it.
Close. I can add any GitHub user. I can see the teams I'm part of in Atom. And basically, I can add Shannon here. I can create an environment. And now, basically, in the upper right-hand corner, I could switch between the two environments. And you'll see in this Shannon's environment, I haven't added any hosts. So he doesn't have any access to the host that I had previously added to the default environment. And so this is a nice, easy way to kind of separate your resources between different teams. And when we say resources, we're really talking about like your hosts. And then anyone who has access to those environments would only have access to those hosts. And though this says it's my default environment, I can always, if I realize, oh, I actually want to add Shannon to it, I can go to here, into the environment. I can edit who I want added to it. I can add him into here so he could see it again. I could change it so he's an owner. There's all these different scenarios that you can do regarding environments, and I really highly recommend if you want to play around with it and it doesn't make sense, you could always go refer back to the documentation. Under configuration, there's our environment section, which talks all about it.
I think it's important there too, Denise, to just kind of hit on sort of the key concept that is environments. I mean, environments are pretty core to the idea of Rancher and container management. I mean, the way to think of an environment is it's sort of like a cluster or a group of resources that work together to run, a certain set of containers and applications. And it's very much a domain of control inside Rancher. So within an environment, you have if you're a member of it, you have visibility into those resources. You have visibility into anything that's going on those hosts. You have a lot of, as a member, you have a lot of control over those things, but you're completely isolated from other environments. So, I can ping from one host or container within an environment to another over the network, or I can I can start, if I'm a member of an environment, I can start a container on the host within an environment. But when but if between environments, there really isn't a lot of connectivity provided by Rancher. Same with things like service discovery and load balancing. They all work within environments, but between environments are really, as you said, they're domains of control. There isn't a lot of, nothing really goes between environments. So if you want systems to talk to each other and work together well, you need to put them in the same environment, or you need to have them communicate to each other, out over sort of a public network or a network that's larger than the one that's living within a single environment, like your corporate network. So lots of questions about environments and access control that came in while you're talking, Denise. I mean, the first one was from Marco. And Marco asked if there was a way to set up authentication without using GitHub. Is that a planned feature? Will LDAP support enable it? Yeah, that's a great question, Marco. Just this week, we released a new release, 0.34. So if you installed Rancher a couple weeks ago, you probably want to do an upgrade and upgrade to 0.34. And within 0.34, yeah.
Sorry, real quick. For LDAP, yes, it is enabled. But when you start LDAP, there are some instructions that we have under installing Rancher, installing server that you'll need to follow, because it will be a little different than your regular Rancher server setup. So that's just something to note about LDAP itself. We have specific instructions for how to enable it in terms of adding your certificates to Rancher server.
Yeah, I mean, setting up LDAP is a little bit more complex than GitHub. GitHub's kind of an easy to do, out of the box. Anyone can set it up in about a minute. LDAP, obviously, you have to have an LDAP service, and you have to be able to get access to it from your organization. So a lot of people will start with GitHub or something, very simple for their pilot or for a test environment, and then integrate with LDAP as they head towards putting Rancher into production. That's been a lot of our experience working with users. Right now, those are the only approaches that are supported, are GitHub and LDAP. We're looking at a couple other supports, including just a native directory within Rancher that will allow you just to add users and credentials directly to Rancher. You may see something like that in the next month or so. But for now, GitHub is what's supported primarily in the beta, and LDAP is newly added. Okay, another question that came in, hopefully that answered your question, Marco. Another question that came in was from Martin, and he said, I'm sorry, from Eric, and he asked, how do I move hosts or services between environments? So if I have, if I want to move a host, from one environment to another, or a service from one environment to another. Can I do that? How would I do that? Do you want to talk about that, Denise?
So, yep, I can talk about that. So really, at this time, there is no, like, environments are completely separated. There's no, I mean, I would say that there's no direct way, at least through the UI, to move it. You would have to, if I say this, my demo here agent, I wanted to move into Shannon's environment, what I'd have to do is actually deactivate it and basically rerun the command, the add host command that comes from Shannon's add host page. Primarily because, this add host, this custom command, we put in some description of, which environment specifically should it launch in. So right now there is no way to directly move it. For the services of moving it, I would say in the UI, once again, we kind of keep environments as completely separate entities. But there is a way that if you realize that you launched the service incorrectly, there is a way that you could kind of download the configuration of what your service has done, and you could use our tool, our CLI, Rancher Compose, and you could launch that up into your other environment. So there are ways to move it from one environment to another. It's just at least probably what you're thinking of what you would want to do. It's not a simple, like, let's just move this resource or these services over to there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and it's kind of a one of the design concepts within Rancher as well is that there's two things to think about here. I mean, we want to create isolation between environments so that you can restrict visibility to people and keep keep security within an environment. If someone has access or compromises access to one area, they don't necessarily compromise access to everything. So from a security perspective, the isolation between environments is pretty important to securing the system. The other thing, though, is that, as Denise said, when you have a host that's already been added to an environment, you can always deregister that host. Even if you've already provisioned a bunch of containers on it, deregister that host and then install a new Rancher container with a new token. And when that container is brought up in the new environment, all the containers that were actually running on it will still be there. So, so Rancher detects containers that are already running on hosts when they're added to Rancher. So if, for instance, Denise Demo Agent 1 is, has 5 or 6 containers running on it, and you decide, I want to pull this out and create a new environment for it, you can do that. You can simply create a new environment, sort of deregister the host, and you can kind of click on deregister there, Denise, and show someone how that would work. But you would deregister the host or deactivate the host, and then when you're ready, you can go back to that host and delete it from Rancher, and then go to the host and actually add in, say, the Shannon credential to that host, and it would add it to the new system. You can see Denise is sort of going through this process. And if we had created containers, those containers would show up in the new service as well. There's another question, so hopefully that answers your question about moving things, Eric. It's not a click and move type of thing right now. It's really, you add things in and you can remove them and you can add them out. It's something that other people have asked for, though, so we have been considering adding it as a feature in the product. There was a couple more questions about GitHub and access control, just to kind of wrap up on that topic. I think there were 2 people that said, we don't use GitHub in our company. Are there any other tools we could use? If we don't want to use GitHub, are there other options? Really, that for right now, the option would be to use LDAP. So if you don't want to use GitHub, the other option is LDAP. So you can set up an LDAP, or you could deploy, you deploy a new LDAP and then connect that, and you can use LDAP as a method. Beyond that, that's all that's supported for access control during the beta period. An Active Directory or LDAP, they're both supported. So you can use Active Directory or LDAP, or you can use GitHub for access control. We were looking at doing the same thing with Bitbucket, which is another, similar to GitHub, is another code repository. And as I said earlier, we may add an integrated directory, so our own access control within Rancher, before we go GA. I think that's likely. So we actually have someone working on that now. So you could see more options coming up, but for now, the options are LDAP and GitHub. Okay, lots more questions that have come in. There was one that Israel asked about limiting someone to be able to access a specific container, or limiting visibility within a container. And I think it's a good question because it really gets to, the concept of role-based access control and being able to, control, who can do what within a system. And this is something that right now Rancher is relatively thin in this area. We only support two types of roles within the system. We have owners and members of environments. And within those concepts, the difference between an owner and a member is, an owner has the ability to modify the environment itself, and members have the ability to add resources. We're actually in the middle right now of working on adding more access control policies and different types of roles, and with the long-term goal of being able to set up different, fully configurable roles that administrators will be able to define. So as an administrator, you could say this is a read-only role, or this person can, has the ability to create certain things, but cannot delete things. Right now, we audit, what people do, but we don't have, detailed RBAC in the beta. So you'll see more capabilities coming on that as the product matures in the next few releases, and we'll be adding, more types of roles. I think the first one you'll see is what we call a read-only role, where you can add a person to a project, but they can't actually make any changes to anything. They can just see this. And then how granular that will get. Like, do we do it just at an environment level, or within to stacks, or down to specific hosts? We're still discussing that. So if you have feedback and there's things you'd like to see, it'd be a great idea to put something into an issue and say, for my team, I really need to have this type of RBAC, or this type of a role, or this level of granularity in terms of controlling access to something. But hopefully that answers your question. Israel is a good question in terms of how do you control things. Right now, you can only invite people to participate and then audit what they do. We don't have individual, read-only roles or very granular access controls. Let's see. Lots more questions coming in. One of them was from Martin. He asked, is there any kind of help docs for running the agent hosts, like suggested method for deploying a specific OS or something like that? Denise, is there anything in the docs that talks about how to run the actual host agents, so the operating system on the host?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I think typically, Martin, really the host, the only requirements for the host is it has to have, it has to be supporting a reasonably new version of Docker, like I think Docker 1.7 or later. And as long as it's supporting Docker 1.7 or later, you can really use on any kind of Linux. In terms of, whether you use Rancher OS or use CoreOS or use Ubuntu or use RHEL, as long as we have a clean installation of Docker, Rancher will work just fine. So there isn't a lot you need to worry about on the host other than making sure that it's running a modern version of the latest version of Docker. And we're always pretty bleeding edge on consuming Docker capabilities, just as Docker's changing pretty quickly. So you'll see over time we'll continue to push people to use more and more recent versions of Docker. So right now we're pushing people to use 1.7 or 1.8, but as that moves forward, we'll probably be pushing people to take advantage of more features over time. Another question on access control and sort of passing things along came in from Mike. And Mike, you asked, will there be a concept of for creating global app stacks for usage across environments? It's a great question. We're going to talk about app stacks in a minute, so we'll talk a lot more about what is an app stack and what does a template look like for deploying applications. But the short answer is yes. We're working on this as a new feature where you'll be able to create an app stack or create like for instance, example like a Jenkins environment or maybe some type of a commonly deployed monitoring service or some type of a commonly deployed Elk stack or something like that, where you would define an application and then you could share it across environments or and across your entire organization. So we're working on that, and we're calling it kind of a stack marketplace or a stack stack platform. So just something to keep in mind. You'll be seeing that, but it's currently not yet available right now. The way people typically do that is they keep all of this in Docker Compose files that they post into GitHub and share within their organization, and people use that to launch. So we're looking at ways to make that even more seamless. Okay, lots of questions are coming in, but I want to kind of jump into back into the training side a little bit, and I'll let Denise talk through a few more things, and then we'll come back and ask a few more questions. Go ahead, Denise.
Okay, that sounds great. Okay, so now that we've added our hosts, what we're going to do next is we're going to go kind of, Shannon briefly mentioned it about app stack. So what is that? So under our applications tab up here, we have things called stacks. So a stack is essentially a group of services. If we click on the stacks, you'll see we've already created a default stack for everyone so that you could easily add your first service. But I could add in, a stack for any application that I have. And once you create the stack, you can add whatever services you want. So we have just a service. A service in Rancher is just a group of containers. So it's just being able to launch multiple of the same container easily. We have the ability to add load balancers, service alias, and external services. So we're going to start with the basics, and we're going to add our first service. So I'm going to try and set up a simple WordPress demo. I'm going to tell you the truth, I haven't done it in a while, but we will see what my memory serves me. So, we will add the MySQL image. You can name your container. Maybe we'll name this database. We'll use the MySQL image. Basically, anything that Docker Run supports, Rancher also supports. A lot of these items are hidden under the advanced options. And, with the MySQL image itself, we need to add in the environment variable for the password. And we'll just call it password1. And then all I do is create. And my service is starting to go. It's starting to register, which is a new state that I haven't seen before, but we'll move on. So then, while this gets going, it will immediately go to inactive state, meaning, I haven't actually started any of the containers. So, I'll start it so that now what will happen is Rancher will start to pick from the host that you have. It will pick a host to deploy. What you'll see come up automatically is something called a network agent. This is a Rancher-specific container that what we use to communicate for our containers to be able to communicate between hosts, cross-hosts, and then, whatever containers you add. Now, I kind of want to bring up, I'm going to go a little off topic of, containers that show up here onto your host itself. There are many ways to be able to add containers into Rancher. If for some reason you find that the UI you don't quite necessarily, it's a little more complicated than you want, you could always, on the host that has been added to Rancher, you could always do a Docker run command on the host itself, and the container will show up in Rancher. And then there's another tool that we'll go into a little bit later called Rancher Compose. So we support all ways of being able to get your containers into Rancher itself. So we're going to continue with my example where I've added my database. The next step I want to add is WordPress to connect to my database. And I will pick the WordPress image, and then I will select my database as MySQL and basically create. And what this does is Rancher will connect it so that WordPress will now sync and be connected to the MySQL image here. I guess, so that's, as this goes on, I think, I'm going to just refer to the docs just because, I mentioned how you could add your services or your containers in multiple ways. And so we kind of tried to mimic the docs. I think, at first it might be a little confusing, but we try to mimic the docs of how a user would probably go down the path of application management. So, using Rancher through native Docker CLI. So this just basically covers the fact that if you just want to use Docker to run your containers on the host, you could do that, and those containers will automatically pop up into Rancher. You could use Rancher Compose And we'll go over that in more detail. And right now, we're just really focusing on like how do we use the UI. And so we've structured the doc so that it's for applications and stacks. We really try and mimic how the UI looks, so that if you had a specific question of how to get your services working, you could go here and get into more detail of, okay, this talks about how we add services, how we add service aliases, load balancers, external services. It just goes into more details specifically of how the UI is laid out. So now our service should be up and running. Sorry, I'm just thinking that I don't think we added any ports. So right now this service, any public ports. So right now this service is running internally in Rancher, and there's no way for us to do it. The next step would be if I could scale up to multiple WordPresses, and I could add a load balancer on top of that. I kind of wanted to take a pause because I know we've been getting a lot of questions, and before I go into load balancing, if there's any questions that we should be answering now, or do you want me to keep going, Shannon?
Yeah, there are a couple of good questions that are worth kind of jumping into right now. One of the questions was about stacks. Ken asked a question. He said, is there any ability, or will there be an ability to build a stack from an existing use of containers, an existing group of containers? And it's a good question, Ken. It's something that you can't do right now. So today, if you start a bunch of containers, or containers are added manually to the hosts, they're not part of a stack. You can't add them to a stack. You can't sort of create a stack out of an existing set of containers. But it's a common request. It's one we've heard from a number of users. So it's definitely in the roadmap, and I think it's in the short-term roadmap. So I think it's something you should see in the next few releases. So good question. Definitely something that's happening and coming around. One of the things that, Denise, I don't know if you showed the compose template that was being created for this environment yet.
Not yet.
Maybe you can just pull that up and talk a little bit about, the concept of compose, and for people who aren't familiar with compose, what it is, how it works, and and how it's created within Rancher, and how you can clone, launch, etc.
Okay, yeah, sure. So yeah, so I kind of walked through how you could set some things up through the UI, and I know there are a lot of people out there who are using Docker Compose to quickly spin up services. So what we've done is created something that's called Rancher Compose, and it follows everything that Docker Compose does. The additional step that it does is it basically allows you to take any of your Docker Compose templates and launch it and have those templates go directly into Rancher itself. And so, you can do it multiple ways. So if you're first getting started, when I first started, the best way to understand Docker Compose was since I was so comfortable with the UI, I could create my, using the UI, create my services, and then what you can do is you can go click on this tab, which will show you the Docker Compose template that you can export, as well as the Rancher Compose side of the template. And so the Docker Compose template side is, you could actually take that template, you could launch it in Docker Compose and spin up those containers by itself. And on the Rancher Compose side, that's where we put the stuff that isn't supported by Docker Compose that we use to be able to, leverage Rancher to show you. So like for instance, if I wanted to scale up my WordPress and just add another container, currently in Docker Compose, you would have to run the command Docker Compose scale, whereas for us, we just include it in the Rancher Compose and say, oh, the scale of that service is now actually 2 containers. And so you wouldn't have to necessarily scale up or down. You would just set what your scale is immediately. And so what you can do is up here in the upper right corner, when you're in the Applications tab, there's the Rancher Compose CLI, and so you can download it for what operating system that you use. I have a Mac, so you can download it and start running it. And I don't have Rancher Compose actually set up quite on my. I have it a little set up on my computer, but basically, we go through how Rancher Compose works for Rancher. Basically, I can go through it in the docs where The only difference really between Rancher Compose and Docker Compose is that to use Rancher Compose, you just need to set, what your Rancher URL is, and then an API key for your environment. And so in Rancher itself, the API key can be created under the settings under API and keys, and you could add one so that for Rancher Compose, it would know specifically which environment you want to launch your services. And after that, we support all the commands that Rancher Compose does in terms of starting services. Now, there are a lot of Rancher-specific services that we also have that we support in Rancher Compose, and it goes into more details in the documentation. I don't know how much time we want to spend on those in terms of talking about the details in this training session.
Yeah, there's a couple of great. It's a good question. I think there's a couple of really good. Really good videos that that I can point you guys to in where we actually have gone through big demonstrations of how to use Rancher Compose and Docker Compose. One of the one of the key things to think about as you're getting up to speed on these is we actually, there's a new project called libcompose that we're working on with Docker that will combine all of this together. So in the long term, we'll probably see Rancher Compose as an additional YAML that you need to use to specify sort of Rancher specific inputs disappear, and everything will be just in a single standard Docker Compose file, which we're really excited about. So, but in general, that's really what the two configuration files are. One is telling, one is a standard Docker Compose file, which sort of sets up the applications and sets up the services and creates the relationships with them. And then the second is a Rancher specific file that provides information that just isn't in Docker Compose that we need, like how many containers do I want to run as part of the service, or how do I want to configure my load balancer. And there's always things that Rancher is going to be doing that are sort of relatively unique. But with the new version of libcompose that we'll be seeing over the next couple of releases, we'll be able to just extend Compose within its own framework. So it's a big improvement there, something to keep in mind. Awesome. All right. So there was a lot of questions that have been coming in. One of them, though, I think is really important to kind of talk about, and that was environment variables. Marco Uskokovic, I hope I got that right, Marco, was asking how the WordPress container you started would know the MySQL password. And he was saying, if he remembers correctly, container links do not expose environment variables. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Denise?
Yeah, I can attempt to talk about that. So specifically when you link a service, in this case this WordPress service to the database, so the WordPress image allows it so that if you name your database, if you give it the name, like an alias of MySQL, it will automatically port over the database name, the host where it's located, what the password is, and that port automatically happens if you were to do even like a Docker run and you launched a MySQL, and then you did a Docker run, and you linked MySQL from your WordPress. And so that functionality already exists in just doing a Docker run. And so for Rancher, we wanted to mimic that same capability where if you just link it to say this container is linked to database as MySQL, then it would start up. But I will. A little strange, though, that this didn't show up. So normally that link would show up, and you could see
the relationships between the two.
The relationship between the two. So I'm not really sure why it's not showing it right now.
Try refreshing your screen. You may just have a port issue. Try refreshing. While you're doing that, there was another question that someone had asked about. I think it was Eric had asked about latency and performance in the network. And Eric, we're going to talk about the network in a little bit. But one of the important things to understand that's happening here in the background is that when you create containers inside of Rancher, you have a couple different options for how to set up networking between those containers. Docker gives you a few choices in terms of how to do networking, and then Rancher adds an additional one. So what Denise is showing here is sort of the concept of networking. Maybe Denise, do you want to talk about networking a little bit, and then we can talk about how we've got a private network that's been created that's allowing these containers to talk to each other even though they're not on the same host.
Yeah, I can try my best to describe it. I'll tell you, before we start, I will admit that I'm not an expert on this topic because I don't usually use anything outside of what we call our managed network. So our managed network is basically, we've created a subnet for all the containers within Rancher across all the hosts. And so really, you're allowing Rancher to be able to manage the containers. And so regardless of which host that the container gets launched on, the containers will be able to ping each other. And I can give a quick demo of how, as you can see, I have containers on 2 hosts. So if I exec into this one, we should be able to ping our network agent, which is at the IP address, and it will automatically respond. So the connectivity between the hosts are there through our managed network, and that's really handled through the network agent, from my understanding, and then we use like the IPsec tunneling between ports 500 and 4500, which need to be open across your host in order for the IPsec tunneling to occur.
Yeah, and Eric, that just to kind of finish your question, you were asking about latency and performance of the network, and generally it's very fast. I mean, we find that it's very much inline speeds. However, there are some corner cases where you can see network performance issues and attune for that. So if you're seeing things, or if your performance isn't where you need it to be, shoot us a service, kind of an issue, and we'll help you take a look at it and maybe tune things and give you some suggestions on how to how to configure networking. That said, you can always choose to use other types of networking, the host network itself and ports, or other types of software-defined network stacks. So there's also other options that you could consider for how you want to do networking between containers. But this is the Rancher native networking.
Shannon, are you still there? You just cut out right between when you were talking about Rancher networking, so I'm not sure if something happened with your phone call. Okay, while we wait for Shannon to get back, I'm just going to go ahead and kind of finish my mini demo of this WordPress. So now I have multiple containers. Oh, Shannon, are you back?
I am, if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. I'm not sure quite what happened earlier. But
okay, I'm back.
Do you want to finish your thoughts on Rancher networking? That's kind of where you cut out.
Yeah, I was just saying that if you're hitting any performance issues or anything like that on the networking, file an issue or hit us in the forums, and we'll take a look and see if we can help you figure it out. But generally, the networking is very fast, line speeds. I mean, people running 10 gig networks using Rancher and not having any problems at all with that. So let us know if you're hitting any issues, and we'll do our best to help you figure it out. Go ahead, Denise.
Okay, no problem. So the next one, I want to talk about is the Rancher's load balancer. And so basically, we will end up running our load balancer uses HA proxy software on our load balancer, and we provide some configuration that HA proxy allows us to do. I will admit right now that there is functionality in HA proxy that we don't leverage right now, but most things that most common requests that people have asked for, if there's enough priority, we always try and add in our product, because we want to talk to our users and be able to leverage whatever you need. And I think most basic use cases we now support. And so we could create a load balancer. And so what happens is, for every load balancer, you'll make a listening port. And so basically, this says that for on your host, if I ping that port, it will target the port in the container itself at a specific sign. So for example, our WordPress example, I'm going to use the source port of 8090, and then right now our WordPress containers are listening on the port 80 on port 80. So I'm going to add this. I'm going to target my WordPress service. So this here right now is like basic L4 load balancing. If you have more advanced requests like L7, so like header requests with path, we go and allow very specific custom ways of being able to target your load balancer. I'd recommend you could read more details about that. Either under the Rancher UI, under our load balancing, we talk about the advanced routing options that we provide. If you're using Rancher Compose, we talk about how do you set up your Rancher Compose, set up under the Rancher services under the Rancher Compose navigation bar. So please read the documentation. We've done a thorough job of trying to explain what are the options, how can you set it up for those new users. And so for this, I'm just going to start it up. And now, whichever host this ends up launching on, I should be able to go to that host and go to the port 89, and we should hopefully see our WordPress site. So let me see where this ended up launching. The load balancer will always be called our LB agent. I'll get the host IP of where it ended up launching, and then go to 8090. And here our WordPress site is up. So that kind of shows how the load balancer works. I can scale up so that if you hit any of our hosts that were on our Rancher network, you would always be directed, and it would go between. It would use the round robin algorithm to go between all the different containers. I think one thing probably to note is, what happens if one of your machines go down, and what. I have all these containers on this host, and what would happen if the host went down? What Rancher kind of does for you. So because of we can try and just do a live example. If I deactivate this and say deleted it from Rancher, what will happen is, as you can see, it automatically started spinning up saying, oh, this host has been removed from this environment, so my database and my container for WordPress needs to be moved over and relaunched automatically. I think at this point probably the downside of the example that I've given is the data and volumes that were in the database don't automatically get moved over and relaunched in my host 3 that I have up. It won't port that volume information over. But if you have services that don't have volumes, at least you know that the container would automatically start up. I know someone had asked.
A question that came in sort of on this about load balancing. There's a couple. The first one was Keitha Raja, who asked, in what IP will the load balancer serve? Is it the same as a Docker IP, or can they assign a public routable IP to the load balancer?
That's a great question. I'm just trying to think of how. I believe you should be able to, but I am not the expert of how to reroute it. I think for the IP itself, I think I'll have to get back to you on that one. I'm sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, typically the load balancer is the same as the Docker IP. So you'll have the IP of the Docker host as the main IP address that you're pushing out there, Keitha Raja. And then you can. Well, often what people will do is they'll use multiple load balancers with Rancher. So they'll run load balancing as they'll run 2 or 3 load balancers on separate containers, or separate hosts, and then use a service like Route 53 from Amazon or Cloudflare that will provide GSLB across those, and they'll use that as then sort of the public, the public side of the DNS, and that's what they'll post. Sort of maybe if they're hosting a website or hosting a web service, they may push to that. So there's definitely a lot of ways to do that. It's certainly something if you want to go into a little bit more, that's definitely worth hitting the forums. It's a bit more of a complex topic. There's another question on load balancers. Was about, where do load balancers actually get provisioned? Can I choose which host they get provisioned on, or can I move them, or do they stay on a host once I say it there? Do I set up scheduling for them? Can you talk a little bit about scheduling load balancers, Denise?
Yep, I'm going to talk about scheduling in probably a more broader concept, just because people might want to schedule specific services on hosts. And so, we provide actually a very lengthy, I think, any ability of what you think you would want to schedule on, you would be able to. And so one of the first simple ones is on a host itself, what you can add a label onto it. So you can add as many labels as you want, and their key value pairs to here. And you could continue adding them. You could also add these labels immediately when you launch your host as well. So when you add a host, even for the custom one, if you chose to add labels here, we automatically update the command so that it would get populated, the environment variables of your host would get populated when you add the host to Rancher. So after we have added our labels, I'm going to bear with me 1 second just because I want to get another host on, because otherwise it won't be as apparent. Let me just get both of these, my 1 and 2, back onto my environment here. Now, when you add any service, and this goes for services as well as load balancers, there will be a scheduling tab here, and so you can, for services itself, you can run all containers on and pick a specific host if you wanted. You can see that now all my hosts are back in my environment. You could create as many scheduling rules as you want, and this is, this kind of mimics a little bit about Docker Swarm, and we have in detail on the documentation a little bit about the differences between Docker Swarm and what we do. But I mean, the concept is roughly the same, where we have affinity rules, and whether or not you can have it match a specific host label of what we've just created, where foo is bar, to say that I want it on that host. You could label your containers themselves. You can see for services I could add labels to them, and so with that you could use anything regarding container labels, container names, service names, and basically you could say I want all my containers to be run on the same host that my other service is running on. And so you have that ability to create your blacklist or whitelist of how you want your service or load balancers to run itself. And as always, in our documentation, we talk about scheduling under Rancher UI. What are all the options? What does it mean? We also talk about it in Rancher Compose. How would you run scheduling through Rancher Compose using our labels? Hopefully that will give at least the understanding of how to, and I guess I'll show it real quick on the load balancer side, where scheduling exists the same. There are some small differences between scheduling services and load balancers, and that's mostly based on restrictions that make sense. For example, in here you can't say that you want all your containers to run on one specific host, because since we're opening the port on the host, you can really only have one container that leverages that port on the host. So, that doesn't make sense to have. You wouldn't actually be able to open 2 containers that use the same port on a host. I mean that covers the ability to schedule. You can label your load balancers, so you could then schedule other load balancers to run on the same ones. I mean, it's kind of, I feel like scheduling to me is like the world is your oyster of however you want to set it up. And so that's really up to you.
There's a couple questions that came in on scheduling, and also a few more on load balancing. One of the questions on scheduling was, is it possible to add support for resource-based scheduling, which is basically saying, put this host on whatever, or put this container on whichever host has the least load on it right now. That is, it kind of goes to there was an earlier topic, Denise was talking about Swarm, and Swarm and Mesos, a few other scheduling approaches really rely on resource-based scheduling. So we're actually working on incorporating those schedulers into Rancher so that you'll have really a choice of how you want to do scheduling, whether you want to use sort of affinity-based scheduling, which tends to be really popular with our users because often they're running in clouds and they have sort of a lot of resources to consume from, and they want to use things like put these two on the same host, or never let A and B run in the same place, or make sure my load balancer is always running on this specific host. Or you want to use things that say, I have a workload, just run it wherever there's spare capacity in my resources. So there's a lot of interesting thing happening around scheduling, and it's definitely an area we're going to be continuing to enhance Rancher in quite a ways over the next few months as well. So lots of good questions there. There was another question about the load balancer, just asking if it was based on HA proxy or Nginx. It's based on HA proxy, so in case that wasn't clear, I think. So that all the load balancing is done with HA proxy. Another question that came up was kind of going way back to when we were talking about hosts, but are there any plans to add integration for Google Compute Engine? It actually brings up a really good question. So if you don't mind hitting the Add Host button for a second, Denise, the things you see here in Add Host that are supported in the UI are only actually a subset of what's supported in the product from the API level. So we actually don't do these integrations ourselves. We don't build the integrations to EC2 and DigitalOcean and Rackspace that you're seeing here. They're actually built by the cloud providers themselves, and they're not built to Rancher. They're actually built to Docker Machine. So Docker Machine is a project that Docker runs, and each of these cloud providers writes a driver. So Google Compute Engine actually has a driver that's already been written that is into Rancher. From an API perspective, you can already use it, but we are adding it to the UI. So adding it to the UI is something that we typically do. We sort of take these things and clean them up. Google Compute Engine has a few sort of uniquenesses about how their system works. It requires actual keys and not just strings but files. So there's a few other special things in that require a little bit of additional work. So Morgan, your question about Google Compute Engine, it should be coming, but it may be another month or so until you see it show up in Rancher. But it is available from the API. So if you want to sort of figure out how to do that, feel free to file a forms ticket, and we'll show you how to do that within Google Compute Engine. There was a couple questions that came up, and I think this is something we're going to talk about in just a second, Denise, but there were a couple questions about, what happens when hosts go down, and how do you do health checks, or, what happens to a load balancer if it's running on a host when it fails, and things like that. So maybe we can talk about it. But before that, I just want to take a look at the time. I know we've been going for about an hour and 15 minutes. We are recording this. I think I mentioned that earlier, so we will be posting this. If you need to run, you got to get to a meeting or something else, no worries. Or if you're somewhere around the world where you're tired and it's late and you want to go to bed, we will be recording this and posting it up on YouTube, so you'll be able to watch the rest if you do need to leave. Okay, do you want to maybe take a second? Let's talk about health checks and talk about what happens when a host fails.
Yeah, I think I tried to cover it briefly when I did my demo of covering it, but basically, on the service side, as I showed earlier, everything has its own scale of how many of containers in your service you want to do. So I could increase the load balancer to 2, and it will automatically scale up and launch however many containers it can on the host. And you can see that's in progress. So what happens is if one of my hosts go down, for example, here you can now see in my example, host number 3 and host 1 are running my load balancer. If I were, to deactivate this host, what will happen is that Rancher will automatically realize that LB agent is no longer running. I think if I delete it, It'll stop running, and then it'll move over. I know, but previously I kind of did the example of stopping it in the UI and watching them run over. I think maybe it would be beneficial if I just went to, you can see this is my host 1. You can kind of see here, this is my host 1, and I have, Rancher running. This Rancher agent instance is the network agent, and this other one that uses this image is our LB agent. And so if I just stop my Rancher agent instance, which will basically stop the communication between the host and Rancher server, you should see eventually, it should relatively quickly show, once it gets stopped, that this host will be in a reconnecting state. Try and refresh it to speed it along just for our demo purposes.
And while you're doing that, there was another question that came in, Denise. It was just asking about, if I'm dealing with the load balancer and the host changes, like the host reboots, will it come back up on the same host? Marco, you would ask that. That is something you'd want to set up in your scheduler. So you'd want to actually go in and say, this container, or in this case, this load balancer, needs to always run on a specific host. And if that was the case, then if you reboot it, it'll always run on that host. It'll come back up on that specific host. So you can set it to do that. Otherwise, you can, if you set it and just say, run this load balancer, anywhere or on any set of hosts, then when it comes back up, it'll come up on, if you take out a host, it'll come up on a new host as it's brought up in the system. So you definitely, for your load balancers, you may want to set it up with a sort of sticky relationship between the load balancer and the host. Shakisha asked a question that was about, will Rancher take care of migrating system volumes when a machine fails? What's the best way to handle database and file storage? And that's a really good question, Shakisha. The volumes on a Docker host are only accessible by containers that are running on that specific volume, on that specific host. So if you want to actually, if you want to be able to recover, let's say in this case of this WordPress environment, you want to be able to recover the database from, agent 3 to agent 2. That's not possible inside of just standard Docker and Rancher as it sits right now, without using sort of an additional type of storage approach. And one of those is Convoy, this new solution we just released this week, which allows you to back up and recover volumes across containers or within a cluster. And using that, what you can do is you can actually take and set up storage on your host that can be backed up to an object store and recovered to another container. There's other ways to do it. You can set up an NFS file share. There's a lot of other good ways to run databases that are distributed using tools like Gluster and others. But but take a look at Convoy. Rancher, you can see at the blog we just released. If you just go to our blog, it should give you a good understanding of how to run persistent data, at least one approach to running persistent data. There's others as well. So we could probably do a whole hour on different options for storage. So if you want to get going, take a look at the forums and take a look at Convoy, and keep an eye on Rancher. We're going to be incorporating a lot of these things directly into Rancher over the next couple months or so. So you'll see a lot of persistent storage handling very soon in Rancher. Okay, Denise, did you want to go any further on to talking about health checks, or do you want to jump into registries? That's something we haven't talked about that I think it's worth hitting on.
Okay, we can. Okay, I just want to show real quick. If your hosts go down, like in my example, I made it so that I killed my Rancher agent, but you could also, another scenario could be that the machine actually goes down itself. What Rancher will do is it detects that the host is down and it's like reconnected. It goes in this reconnecting state and kind of has this question mark because it just doesn't know what the status of this host. And we try and make it red so it's very obvious to the user if you're scanning through your host that something's wrong. In this case, we usually we don't update any agents yet until you kind of figure or move any containers around until we I think as a user, you figure out, like, is it something that I actually want to remove from my environment, or is it something that I need to just fix and get it up and running? So one thing I could do in this scenario is I could just relaunch Rancher Agent. Since I stopped it, I could just start it again, and it would reconnect, and everything would just start working again. But what if the machine went down and it really was, I really did actually want to disconnect it from Rancher itself? I could just deactivate it and remove it from Rancher, and what will happen is this, as it gets removed, you'll see that my load balancer that had a scale of 2 will automatically go find the next available host to be able to get running. And I want to say, like, one of the most common scenarios we have that I can probably recreate here is if I end up scaling up again. So right now I only have, with my load balancer, since it leverages the host's public ports, I only have 2 hosts that are now available. If I tried to scale up this service to 3, something is going. If I try, anyways, as this goes on, if I try to scale this up to three load balancers, what will happen is it will kind of get in this updating active state, because Rancher will just continually try and find an available host for it to launch, but it kind of won't be able to find a host since I only have 2 hosts that have public ports that are already being used by 2 of the other containers.
Right. One of the questions that came in, Denise, was about host or container, CPU, memory, network graphs, things like that. Do you think you could maybe just jump into show how we can pull logs and pull utilization from the UI, and then if any of this is available from the API in JSON or XML?
Sure. So if you click on the, let's go back to the host page. If you click on the host name, you can go into this, I call it the detailed host page, where it'll give you all the information, static information of the host itself. It will show a graph of what's being used, the memory. In the drop down, either from the detailed host page or even on all the host page, you can view an API, everything regarding the host, and it has all that same information in the API as well. And that kind of goes with almost everything in Rancher, where the containers itself, we allow you to execute into the shell easily from the UI. You can view the logs of the containers itself. You can go into the API again, and it gives you all the stats that you want and everything. Anything that you can kind of set in Rancher or even in Docker will show up here as well. I think, does that answer kind of your question that you're asking, Shannon? And like, you can go to the container itself and see what's being used.
Yeah, it does. I think that helps. Is there any way to see the storage usage of containers?
At this point, no.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Keitha Raja asked that about do we show the storage usage of the containers? That's something that we've been looking at adding and figuring out a good way to add. So that may be something you'll see in the next couple of releases, but it's not there yet, Keitha Raja. So okay, Denise, we're about an hour and a half in, so it's probably time to start wrapping this up. I think we've answered most of the questions that have come in by people. If you have any more questions that we haven't hit on, please, don't hesitate to fire them in now while we're going through the last few things. But just going through it, I think we've talked about setting up Rancher. We've talked about access control, setting up LDAP. We've talked about the value of environments and what they are in terms of a limiting scope. We didn't really talk about registries, so maybe if you can just sort of talk about private registries, and then we can go through a little more.
Sorry about that. It's okay. Asked it, and I completely just forgot. So under, we kind of call that configuration. So really, you can configure to add any registry. You can add, your private Docker Hub registries, a Queta.io one, or any custom registry that you want. And then from the image, the the service, the image name here, you could just reference your private registry to be able to do it. By default, we are going to Docker Hub, and in the documentation, it talks about configuring registries and how to do, if you have insecure registries, self-sign certificates, how to, add them to your Docker so that you could leverage them using Rancher. And then, here's the kind of just how the command that you would run in Docker run to access your registries is how you would access the image through Rancher as well. Because we really are leveraging whatever Docker run does. We don't want to make it farly different than what you would have done in Docker. We're just trying to make it easy for you.
Awesome. And another question, I think Shakisha asked, if we would try include a private registry, inside of Rancher. Shakisha, you're not the first person to ask that question, so it's definitely one that we've heard from other people. In fact, Darren, our chief architect, and I were just talking last night about another, some thoughts on this. So we're looking at a couple different options for sort of incorporating a registry into Rancher. I mean, we really, Docker Hub itself is great. Key.io is great. Building your own registry is great. Docker's 2.0 registry is great. There's a lot of good options for running a registry. So we really don't want to go and duplicate all of that effort and build, another one. So, in terms of how we might make a private registry work inside Rancher, we may just run it as a service, and it would be very easy to deploy a service within Rancher that was a private registry, and and then attach that to specific projects or environments and such. So we're still thinking about what something like that would look like, but by and large, the public registries, the enterprise Docker Hub, they're all great options. They work great with Rancher, so there are definitely options out there, I think, for people. Go ahead.
Dan, I don't mean to interrupt. I think he actually wants us to try and add a private registry, like a registry to our Rancher. I'm going to admit that I don't have one for myself to be able to access at this time, but I can definitely, I could, work with the QA, my counterparts in the QA team to go through the steps, and then maybe we can make, for the next training session, we can go through the physical act of adding in a private, like an insecure private registry. If that's something, I know it sounds like Shakisha, I also recommend, ask for question on the forum or in GitHub if you have issues of what specifically are you having troubles with, and we can try and troubleshoot it then as well.
Got it. Hey, there's another good question that Ken just posted. So Ken asked, he mentioned that his QA and production environment won't have internet access. Is it possible to put the agent or even the server into our private registry to make it easier to pull down to the servers without internet connectivity? And the answer to this, Ken, is that yes. This is actually a pretty common request from large organizations and people who are running the service, behind firewalls without internet access. We actually have a whole set of features you can see in GitHub that we're working on right now. We call air gap support, and it's basically how to support deploying Rancher behind the firewall. And to deploy it in a way that doesn't require you to pull anything from Rancher. We've got actually most of it is finished. I
can talk about it because
Denise, you want to talk about it a little bit more? Yeah.
Yeah. So I just pulled up in the documentation. So we just added this section about launching Rancher server with no internet access. There's even a specific section for Ken on how to use a private registry. Right now, the one caveat I will say is that Rancher server is able to run without the internet, but right now the web browser, will still need to access. We'll need to access both the internet and your private network to be able to work. And we're still working on the UI. That's the last final piece of probably that is to get the UI side to also be able to work without direct need of the internet. But I think Ken, I can post this link to Ken's question so that he could take a look at it,
Awesome.
Just to read about it, because I think exactly what he's asking about is we've already documented how to do. And it just came out. You'll need to make sure it's only running as of version 34. So just make sure you have that version with you.
Yeah, and that's, guys, that's just something to keep in mind during the beta is that's really the earlier question today. Can I run this in production? The big thing to think about is just it's changing a lot. We're continuing to listen to this feedback, to improve Rancher, to add new features. So that's the big the big thing to keep in mind. But we recently did a survey of the hundreds and hundreds of people who've actually joined the Rancher beta, and I think 45% of people are actually now running Rancher in production at some level or another. So, I wouldn't encourage you to go run, if you're a bank, my checking account on Rancher yet. So maybe that gives you an idea of my level of confidence. But if you were just running a website, I probably wouldn't tell you to lose any sleep over it. Okay, we've talked about registries. We talked about adding resources. We talked about adding hosts. We talked about the UI, the API, the CLI for Rancher. We talked about, obviously spinning up containers either directly from Docker, from the API, from the UI, and how Rancher can detect containers when they're already added. We talked about adding stacks and how services come in, and the concept of Docker Compose and Rancher Compose. So hopefully that gives you a starting point for those concepts. We talked about load balancing, service discovery, and I think we touched on networking at least a little. So hopefully in the last 90 minutes we've been able to get you going and started on using Rancher. There's a few more questions that have been popping in before we say goodbye. So let's see if we can answer these last ones. Let's see. Shakisha asked, we're using a private registry because we have low bandwidth, and when deploying a custom container, we do a lot of Docker file modifications and commits. For this reason, we chose a private registry, but we encountered a lot of difficulties because no error is given when adding a private registry. There's no checking before letting you add. Yeah, Shakisha, that sounds like something we maybe could help you with best in the forums, because it sounds like your point about the lack of error codes and stuff is probably very true. It's something we're constantly trying to improve in Rancher's better error handling and giving you more visibility into why something didn't work as it was supposed to. So we'd love to help you troubleshoot this issue. It's probably something that would be better doing it one-on-one than here. So if you have logs, or if you have some more specifics and you wouldn't mind going to forums and posting it, Denise and I will take a look as soon as we get out of here and see if we can work with you to troubleshoot and figure out why you're not able to get your private registry working. So I'm sorry that you hit that issue.
Yeah, I'd probably like to really highlight the fact that I'm a very active user in on the forums as well as GitHub issues. So for anyone who's encountering issues, please file them, ask them. If I cannot immediately answer, I always try and find my coworkers who helped work on it to help do it. So it's really a great resource we have out there to be able to help not only yourself but the community, because I'm sure if you're facing that same issue, someone else has either faced it or has similar ideas or similar questions as you. So I really just want to reiterate that you should really go. I'm also, if you wanted to, in IRC. I'm usually there during the daytime, Pacific daytime, and trying to answer questions as well.
Can you remind everybody what the IRC channel is too, in case they don't know, Denise?
It is it's on Freenode, and it's like Rancher is the channel.
So if you go to Freenode, you should be able to find us. And then Marco, last question right now. Is the private registry available as a complete/functional container? Does it only host Docker Compose.yaml and Rancher Compose YAML, or actual Docker images? Whose job is it to build image registries or Rancher's host? Marco, I may have you clarify if I didn't answer that correctly, but yeah, the private registry is not actually incorporated inside of Rancher. It's something that users build or host themselves. You can get it as a service by just going to Docker Hub. So Docker Hub is a good example of a public registry, but it also allows you to sign up for an account. And once you sign up for an account, then you have a private registry that you can keep your personal Docker images in. And so the registry really is it's a directory that you use when you go to create a Docker container. You create a container from an image, and that image is either a public image, like what Denise used when she created WordPress or MySQL, or it's a private image, which would be your build of your software, and say, kind of create a container from my build of my software that you've packaged as a container. So to take, code and package as a container, you're really, it's really kind of the final step of your build process. So you build your code, you turn it into artifacts, and then once you have your artifacts where you want them, you package those into a Docker container, an image, and then you can create containers from that image. So those images are kept in a Docker registry, and that registry is not where you keep things like Compose or Docker Compose or Rancher Compose. It's really you keep the Docker images themselves. Docker Compose and Rancher Compose really are generally kept either locally on your machine if you're spinning up from the CLI, or within GitHub more than likely if you're working as a team and you want to be able to deploy from a central repository or some other kind of artifact repository. So you want to keep that wherever you keep maybe your chef scripts or where you keep your code itself. So hopefully that answers your questions about the registry. Okay, I think we've gotten through all the questions, Denise. Thanks everyone for attending. It looks like we still have almost everyone here, so I appreciate you sticking around for an hour and a half to go through this. As Denise said, we're hosting the same thing, or at least some version of this, every Thursday, meaning if you want to come back next week and you have new questions, we'll be covering some of the basics again, probably for people who are attending, but we'll also be answering questions and going through new things, stuff that's changed. You're also welcome to invite your colleagues. If you just forward them on the how to sign up, they can sign up themselves. So feel free to come back and ask more questions, or if you're hitting issues and you're not getting the kind of support you need out of the forums, you can always come here and we'll do our best to prioritize helping you work through your issues. But thanks a lot for participating in the beta. Thanks for coming today. Denise, thanks for doing this first training for us, and I appreciate you taking the time to go through so much and all the work you do in the forums and the docs and everything else. Denise writes most of these docs and also leads all the QA work on Rancher, so she's sort of the lead person out there beating it up and finding issues, her and the rest of our QA team. So it's awesome to have you as part of the team. Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see everyone who comes back next week. Have a great day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.